Hi, my name is Yanina and I'm from Ukraine. Strong support of Ukraine during the war is because Ukrainians are white Europeans. During more than 2 months of full-scale war, such and similar statements have been made many times, including by the Pope. All those statements are mostly addressed to those who provide support and not to Ukrainians themselves. But in those statements, the speakers use Ukraine as an occasion for conversation and illustration to analyze certain problems. Ukraine itself and the causes of the war fall out of context. So Ukrainians certainly are white Europeans from the point of view of culture, anthropology and geography. However, in this way, Ukraine is included in much wider political and historical concepts. This draws Ukraine as one of the wealthy whites who have more privilege. Ukraine: discrimination, chauvinism and racism. The problem is that the history of Ukraine is not widely known in the world. The historical concept of Ukraine and Eastern Europe in general differs from that of Western Europe. Ukraine has never been an empire. In this video, I want to outline how Ukraine relates to the themes of racism and discrimination using postcolonial theory. Colonialism. Colonialism gives us an understanding of the historical basis of ideas about biological or cultural supremacy. If you conquer a different nation, then you have to explain, including to yourself, why you have the right to do so. This is one of the reasons why empires justify violence, either by their own biological or cultural superiority, or by the need to turn so-called barbarians into civilized people, and so on. Mass colonization by Europeans of faraway Africa, North and South America, Australia and Asia led to the formation of racially divided societies and institutional racism. However, the conquest of the empire could affect surrounding nations too, as in the case of Russia and Ukraine. During the 20th century, many former colonies of France and the British Empire became independent countries. And in racially divided societies, there were movements for equal rights. That's when postcolonial studies appeared. What are postcolonial studies about? The consequences of colonialism are long-lasting. The conquering country defined its culture as universal, normal, or simply better. Then, it defined the culture of the colony as different, exotic, or simply worse. There is an opposition between we, the norm, and they, the difference. The empire creates the narrative about the colony, defines the people of the colony from specific point of view, having the power and superiority. So the people from the colony had become to feel themselves as not the norm or inferior. Postcolonialism tries to change this perception, in particular by putting the culture of the colony at the center and giving voice to the people of the colonies to talk about themselves and about the world in general. After the collapse of the USSR, in the 1990s, researchers from Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, began to use postcolonial studies to explain what their society are going through. How it's different when the people of the center of the empire and the people of the colony don't have significant racial differences. First of all, it's easy for people of the colony to assimilate, to be just like the main, best nation of the empire. But what if they don't want to do so? The history of colonialism in Ukraine. Ukraine developed in the European context. It was no less economically developed than the Moscow state. But the Moscow state was built around the aggressive conquest of neighboring Finno-Ugric, Siberian and other peoples. According to the 1897 census, the population of the Russian Empire spoke more than 100 languages. Thus, in the middle of the 17th century, Ukraine came under the aggressive policy of Muscovy, and at the end of the 18th century, it became a colony of the Russian Empire. What colonial policy has Russia pursued in Ukraine for 300 years? Destruction of Ukraine's autonomy and community self-government at the end of the 18th century. Numerous restrictions on the Ukrainian language, propaganda of the idea that the Ukrainian language doesn't exist and it's a dialect of Russian or Polish. Massive Russification. The imposition of Russian culture as an universal and Russian language as in the only one for use in social life. Cultural appropriation of Ukrainian songs, dishes of national cuisine, and even artists, writers, etc. Appropriation of history. The history of Kievan Rus is not directly related to Russia, which is only partially belong to this state. Repeated enslavement. In the 18th-19th century, later during the Soviet era due to forced labor of peasants without the right to change their place of residence. Deportation of the indigenous population of Crimea, Crimean Tatars, with a ban to return on their own lands. Organization of the Holodomor genocide, an artificial famine in 1932-33 that led to the death of more than 4 million Ukrainians. So, we already had horrible moments in our history that have been unnoticed by the world, and Western Europe in particular. In fact, Russia's colonial policy is the answer to why many in the world didn't know about the existence of one of the biggest nations in Europe, Ukrainians. What are the postcolonial consequences for Ukraine? The stereotypical image of a Ukrainian as an exotic, comic character in a national dress was actively imposed. Like Ukrainian is not a modern person, but a folklore image. This character is not very clever, but cunning and capable of betrayal. This stereotype has become widespread in Soviet, Russian, and, unfortunately, even Ukrainian literature, movies, or comedy shows. Many Ukrainians have developed and still have an inferiority complex. For a long time, Ukrainians continued to consume Russian pop culture, which led to the spread of stereotypes about Ukrainians and the spread of Russian propaganda. Many Ukrainians began to speak Russian. During USSR, it was not necessary to study Ukrainian at school. The Ukrainian language was presented as the language of the village, not the city, a language in which science and culture cannot be created. People were ashamed to speak Ukrainian, and someone still does. That's why fewer people use Ukrainian in public, but more in private. Ukrainophobia. The ongoing war proves that Russia not only hasn't changed its attitudes towards Ukraine, but also wants to literally conquer and turn it back into a colony. Not calling this war a war, but a special operation, at the same time, Russia doesn't hide its intention to destroy Ukraine. Russia didn't start this war for economic reasons, otherwise why destroy entire cities and cause multi-billion-dollar damage to civil infrastructure? The war is making poorer not only Ukraine, but Russia as well, because of economic sanctions. This war has a purely ideological and political basis. The leaders of Russia and many Russians claim that Ukrainians don't exist as a separate nation, but only as a part of the Russian nation, and that Ukraine's desire for independence is equal to Nazism. Therefore, they justify the aggression by denazification of Ukraine. And of course, there are no significant anthropological differences between Ukrainians and Russians, such as skin color. But again, this fact, as well as the consequences of Russification, Russia uses to deny the existence of the Ukrainian nation. Can we call it racism? To be honest, I'm not sure this definition is appropriate. But we certainly can call it chauvinism and Ukrainophobia. This discrimination is based primarily on cultural differences. After all, the modern Ukrainian nation is a cultural and political community to which people of different ethnic backgrounds belong. Can we call it genocide? Genocide is the intentional destruction of a people as an ethnic, national, racial or religious group, in a whole or in part. Several national parliaments, including those of Ukraine, Poland, Estonia and Latvia, declared that genocide was taking place, as well as many scholars of genocide. Among them, historian of Eastern Europe and the Holocaust Timothy Snyder, who said that an analysis of the statements by Vladimir Putin over several decades showed that Putin had long-standing genocidal intentions against Ukrainians. All this is becoming more and more recognized in the world.
Yes, I called it genocide.
Yes, terrible conflicts are happening in other countries as well. I don't think it's appropriate to compare who suffers more. I'm in favor of other countries to be supported no less than Ukraine. But I call for support for Ukraine. Living during the war is a very specific experience, so Ukrainians now understand very well, say, Syrians, whose cities were also bombed by Russia. At the same time, people living in peaceful and prosperous country have the opportunity to choose whether to support a warring country and its people or to ignore what is happening. So, thank you for watching. You can support us by promoting information about Ukraine. So please subscribe to this channel and put a thumb up below this video.